Hi folks, it's Camberley based with Evaluator Group. We're back here with the video insights. I've got two folks joining me today. One is Krista Macomber, who is our senior analyst on data protection. Welcome. And secondly, I have Sathya Sankaran, who is the COO from Catalogic. Welcome. So today what we're going to talk about is backup as a service and the rise of the cloud. We published some information on the backup as a service. So a while ago, I think it was the end of last year, that Krista put out. A lot of questions, a lot of inquiries on it. So we're shooting another video on it. So let me kick it off. Last year, we heard a good deal about the rise of the public cloud. We saw that in our COVID-19 studies, which are free, the March and the September ones that we released. Drilling into the details, we see a stronger affinity to use the public cloud nowadays for data protection than probably any other use case, particularly in the enterprise. What does your data show and why? Krista, you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah. So it was interesting. We asked customers to sort of identify which IT projects had been either positively impacted by the pandemic and which had been negatively impacted. And what we found, kind of to your point, Camberley, was that public cloud and data protection were two areas that were kind of most positively impacted by the pandemic. And really what we found was that IT was caught a little bit flat-footed by the sudden need to work from home and support this nearly fully kind of remote workforce. In some cases, they were looking to try to actually use their data protection, disaster recovery infrastructures to be able to kind of support this remote accessibility. And we also found that there were a number of new kind of security threats that have emerged as well. So sort of they were looking to try to be able to scale up some data protection infrastructure and capabilities as quickly as possible. And also really looking to help to sort of bypass the need for IT staff to have to physically go into a data center as well. So that sort of really, to your point, kind of drove both a demand for public cloud, but also specifically for some of these data protection use cases.
Yeah. And Sathya, you guys have recently announced a new offering that you're doing up in the cloud. So clearly you were seeing the same thing. So talk about what was going on in your minds, what you were trying to do, and now that you're out in the market.
Awesome. Yeah. What we saw was very consistent with what Krista was talking about. I think partly we are trained as IT professionals to kind of use your copies to test anything, right? Mm-hmm. You don't normally test it with your production data, you test it with your non-prod data, copies of your data set. So I think people utilizing these public cloud providers for data protection just seems like a very natural flow for us. Backup and DR was already an insurance policy for a lot of people, and we know group insurance works in that industry, right? So I think public cloud providers just kind of became that de facto option for a lot of users. And I think it's also somewhat related that public cloud adoption for primary data is also tied to a positive impact with data protection, because if you're ready to start giving up your cars to start using trains for your primary use cases, you're kind of going to be in the same boat with your data protection as well. So I think we're seeing that a lot of people are very comfortable moving their backup workloads to S3 storage, object storage. And I think it's only natural that backup became the first use case for the adoption of public cloud.
Yeah. And Krista, when you did the analysis on the backup as a service offerings, the cloud offerings, I should say, there were a lot of differences, or if you want to talk about in general, where were the differences? What kind of things should the IT guys be looking for?
Sure. So I think sort of at the start, we had to put a little bit of a stake in the ground in terms of what actually is backup as a service. And what our research tends to focus on right now is essentially backup software that's being delivered through the cloud. And this is sort of a little bit of a different approach from some of the more fully managed offerings that we might see in the marketplace. But really, there are some big differences in terms of the different sources, for example, that the backup offerings might support. So, for example, some of them are a little bit further down the road in terms of supporting Kubernetes and container environments than others, and also a little bit further down the road in terms of supporting some cloud-native databases, for example. So those are kind of a couple of the differences that we see. And then there are a number of factors in terms of things like being able to kind of control the backup schedule, how frequently backups are taken, the granularity and flexibility for recovery capabilities are another couple examples. But then also sort of the ability to be able to then, tier some of these backup data copies to kind of colder data stores, if you will, for longer term archiving, long-term retention, because this data does need to be kind of stored oftentimes for quite some time for compliance, legal discovery, things like that.
Yeah. And, there's some, differences, especially sometimes in how they operate in the different public clouds. So on Google or AWS and Azure, et cetera, that we see. So let me switch over. You mentioned containers. From our data, literally over 70% of the companies have some sort of level of container adoption. Granted, most of that, I mean, like 90% of it is all developer adoption at this point. We're just starting to see the actual production systems going out there. That is in the enterprise. We think that's probably about 10%. It also appears that Kubernetes is the winner with container orchestration. So given this background, what planning needs to be done to prepare for this next platform that we're going to see IT sitting on? Sathya?
Yeah, I think you raised a lot of good things. Kubernetes is becoming the de facto standard for container orchestration and app-driven orchestration. One of the things that we just have to acknowledge is that containers weren't built for stateful workloads when it was originally envisioned. So I think what you're seeing from users is a bit of healthy skepticism. They do understand that it wasn't built to be serving stateful workloads. It's being adapted, and I think a lot of positive progress happening for that ecosystem. So I think what you see from users today is an acknowledgement that it wasn't built for it and it's being adapted for it. So they're looking at other options. And when they look at Kubernetes as the platform of choice for all cloud native workloads, they're looking at where to put their stateful workloads. And that's where cloud databases are emerging as their choice. And we see over 50% of Kubernetes users are relying on cloud databases like AWS RDS or Azure SQL or Cloud SQL from Google. These are becoming their choice of platforms for stateful workloads. And I think, again, as a backup as a service provider ourselves, our job is to provide coverage irrespective of how you use these different service providers. And so I think what we looked at is we not only had to provide support for Kubernetes, with a lot of them using public cloud databases for their stateful workloads, we really had to provide support for that combination as well. And what we tried to do with our recent announcement to support AWS RDS in addition to all the Kubernetes capabilities we have in our CloudCasa offering.
So Krista, what are you saying? What are you talking to customers about preparing for this next platform?
Sure. So the conversations that I'm having are a lot around sort of preparing for the protection of the persistent data, but also sort of the container state itself. Because as these container environments move into production, they are generating data that does need to be protected. And tools like Kubernetes, while they orchestrate the creation and the management and things like that of the container environments, they don't provide data services. So they don't provide things like, the backup and recovery, and high availability capabilities, for example. So we're really advising customers to think about, these container environments like they might kind of a physical or a virtual environment, and think about providing the same levels of things like RPOs, RTOs, and really the same data protection service levels that they might have for some of these other environments as well.
Great. So Sathya, you were talking about a little bit about public cloud. I mentioned the public cloud differences. Did you want to you had something to say about that and what you guys were observing in terms of those environments?
Yeah, interestingly, I wear the hat of a customer as well as a solution provider in this space, right? So when I'm looking at public cloud providers, there are a few T's that I try to cross. What we see is first, you kind of have to have that service availability. Not every service is available through various cloud providers. And the timing of launch is very important for a lot of these services to be used. Second, we certainly look at reliability, and we want to have predictability in terms of performance, downtime, the number of regions it's available in. Can I have a copy of the same data sitting in another region, and how easy it is? These are all things we look at. We look at flexibility and adaptability. There is Kubernetes versions coming out. Not every cloud provider offers the same version of Kubernetes in their managed ecosystem, right? CSI snapshots have been around. Not all Kubernetes providers have the same level of CSI support today. We look at security. We want to make sure that it is a shared responsibility. Yes, we have some responsibility to security, but so does the cloud provider. And as a solution provider, perhaps more so than a customer, we certainly look at popularity as well. There is a network effect when it comes to where the ecosystem is building. And obviously, you want to be part of a very strong ecosystem.
Yeah. And what we have found is that each of the clouds track different types of customers, or it seems to be from our data that we have. And when we start slicing it across, we can see that, Google tracks certain people in certain use cases, primarily the same thing with AWS, and then Azure, being obviously leveraging their very strong Microsoft relationships that they have and people that want to reside there. So with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. And we have some research that's free on Backup as a Service. We'll stick a link up there for you guys, so you can just click on that and go grab it if you register on the site. Sathya, thank you very much for joining us and taking time out of your very busy day. And we'll catch you the next time around. Take care.
Thanks for having me.